Before we look at the text, just a few things about today's lesson. Today we're going to do an entire chapter, which is something that I've never done before when we're going through books of the Bible verse by verse. It's 44 verses. And so ordinarily I read the text first so we can kind of have it in mind and then go back and start walking through it. Today I'm not going to do that because it's so massive. We're just going to jump in and I'll comment as we go along. Quickly, what's the context here? The Apostle Paul was a prisoner. When he was first imprisoned in Jerusalem, well, not the first time he was imprisoned, but in this story right here, he was imprisoned in Jerusalem, and Jesus appeared to him. This doesn't happen every day. And Jesus appeared to him in his cell and said to him, "Take courage, Paul. You have witnessed for me in Jerusalem, and you will also witness for me in Rome." And you may at that point expect that, oh, they're just going to release him and he's going to go on his merry way over to Rome, but that is not what happened. He remains in prison for another 2 years. He's moved to Caesarea, where he spends 2 years there in prison. And because he saw that his case was not moving, he had the right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar. He could ask to be sent to Rome to be judged there, and the governor of Judea agreed to that. And so chapter 27 now is Paul's journey towards Rome. The beginning, because he doesn't get there in chapter 27, but it's the beginning of his journey to Rome, and he is a prisoner as he's being moved. Today I have a bunch of slides. That's why we met up here, because I want to show you a few things, because I want you to be able to follow what the text is talking about. So really quick, do we know what we're looking at right now? The blue is the sea, the white is the land. For those of you who are geographically challenged, right in the middle is Greece, right there. Okay, do we know what we're looking at? Okay, over on the left, that's Italy. We've got modern-day Turkey. It wasn't called Turkey back then. We got Syria over there. We got Egypt down there. Okay, so we know what we're looking at. Paul is in Caesarea down in Judea, and he is heading for Rome, which is in Italy, right over there. Okay, so that's a long ways that he has to go. He's not going to make it by the end of chapter 27. He will make it there in chapter 28. So I'm going to zoom in right to there so you know what we're looking at. And here we are. Okay, a few places, because a lot of names are going to be mentioned. A few names that are going to be mentioned in passing. We got the island of Crete over there. Asia, when it says Asia, we mean Asia Minor. Okay? Today we call it Asia Minor. Back then we just called it Asia. Over there is Lycia, Pamphylia, Cilicia, Cyprus over there. Okay? And we are in Caesarea, where our journey is going to begin. Okay, so we got what's going on. Now let's turn to our Bibles, even though we're going to be looking up there a lot today. Verse 1. When it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So Paul is not the only prisoner. There's other prisoners also, and they are being moved under the authority of a centurion named Julius. And obviously he's not the only. There's other soldiers, obviously, watching all these prisoners. Verse 2. So, entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coasts of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So they get in a ship. It says that it's a ship of Adramyttium. Adramyttium is in Asia Minor. And so the plan of the ship is to head on to Asia Minor, and then I guess Paul and his fellow travelers are going to switch boats somewhere along there and head over to Italy. Now, they're not getting onto a navy ship or anything like that. The Roman Empire did have a fleet, but they didn't use it just to move a couple of criminals. So they would have, and there's no passenger ships back then, right? And so if you want to go on if you want to travel somewhere by boat, you find a merchant ship and you say, hey, where are you going? I'm heading over there. Okay, can I pay you and you take me? Yes, thank you, okay. So Julius the centurion finds a ship that's heading off towards Asia Minor, and they say, all right, we'll do that, and they all get on board. Also, in verse 2, we read there are two friends of Paul that travel with him. One of them is Aristarchus. We have seen Aristarchus before when Paul was heading to Jerusalem several chapters ago. Aristarchus was with him. He's a brother from the church in Thessalonica. And there's a second guy who's traveling with Paul. Did you notice? Did you notice another guy traveling with Paul? Up into in the previous chapters, when it spoke about Paul and those with him, it spoke about him and them. Now it switches to us and we, because Luke, the writer of the book of Acts, is also with them. So Paul has got two friends with him. Thankfully, they could pay for their own ticket. I'm sure the Roman Empire isn't paying for them. And so Luke and Aristarchus are with Paul. Verse 3 says, and the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. So really quick, they leave Caesarea and they go up north just a little bit to Sidon. And we know from other texts in Acts that there was a church in Sidon, there were believers in Sidon, and they knew Paul, and so he gets some help. Because keep in mind, when you're traveling on a merchant ship, they don't have cabins for you, they don't have food for you, and everything like that. You have to take care of yourself. And so he's a prisoner. When you were in prison, in fact, Rome gave you the bare minimum so that you wouldn't die, but they didn't care if they didn't, take that good care of you in prison. So you had to have friends who would take care of you. So thankfully, he knows some people in Sidon, and maybe they helped him out with some food or clothes for the trip or whatever. And it seems that Julius is a pretty nice guy. I guess he doesn't think that Paul is too much of a threat. I'm sure he has a guard go with him, but he allows him to have some freedom and go see his friends. Verse 4, when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. So where do they want to go? They want to head towards Asia. They want to head that way. But it says that the winds were contrary. Boom, there you go. I put the winds also. And so they're like, this is not going to work to go out into the open sea like this with contrary winds. So they're like, we're scratching that. And they go by the coast, try and get some shelter from Cyprus. Verse 5, and when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. So again, just going along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, and they reach Lycia, and they are in Myra, which is right over there. With good winds, they could have done this trip in 4 or 5 days, with good winds. So not having winds helping them, this could have taken twice the time. Plus they had to do a little bit of a circle over there. So it could have been 10 days to get there. It's been a while. Verse 6, there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. Okay, so they switched ships, because this one is going to continue on into Asia Minor. And so they get another one, which is probably a bigger ship, which is going to sail all the way to Italy, an Alexandrian ship. Verse 7, when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidos, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete, off Salmoni. Okay, so they leave, they head off this way, past Cnidos it says, but the winds are just not helping at all. And so they're like, they probably wanted to head off this way towards Italy, but they're like, this is not going to work. And so they head down, they're being pushed, they head down past Salmoni, and they get a little bit of shelter off of Crete. Verse 8, Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. All right, I'm going to switch and zoom into Crete now, okay? Because we're getting into the nitty-gritty. That is the island of Crete. Winds are still blowing in this direction. That was Salmoni. They came down, they come across, they stop at a port called Fair Havens next to a city called Lasea. Okay, now from Myra to here, it should ordinarily take 4 or 5 days. But again, Paul is stressing, Luke is stressing that it's taking them so long to move. And so it's probably double that. And so from Caesarea to here, it's something that you could probably do in 7, 8, 9 days. But now it's probably taken like 3 weeks or something. So it's going much slower than they had hoped. All right, so let's look at verse 9 now. It says, "Now when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them," and it goes on to advise them, hold on, but really quick. It says the fast was already over. What is that talking about? In the Bible, are there any fasts commanded by God? I know that today there's all kinds of fasts if you follow Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox and stuff like that. However, in the New Testament, there are no specific days that you are commanded to fast. So what is this fast? Well, in the Old Testament, there is one day a year. One day a year in the whole liturgical calendar of the Jews. There was one day out of the year that you were supposed to fast. Anyone know what that was? Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, that's right. And so that is late September, early October. And so keep in mind, so in the Roman Empire, if you have ships traveling, safe time for ships to travel are May to September. Okay, mid-May, mid-September, that's when we travel. Maybe a month or so in the spring, and maybe a month or so in the fall, but it's dangerous. November, everything shuts down. Not allowed to travel by boat from November to like March or something. Okay, and so so the fast is already passed. So we're in October. We're in the dangerous zone now. You travel at your own risk. I'm sure they had wanted to go much, much further, but the winds have not helped them. So they cannot make it to Italy now. It's impossible. So they have to stop, and they have to spend the summer somewhere. They have to spend the winter somewhere. They can't take a long journey now. And so Paul advises them at the end of verse 9 and into verse 10. Paul says, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives." Now, there is no explicit statement that this is a prophecy. It's not that it doesn't say that God told them this, but even if he didn't, Paul is an experienced traveler by sea. If you take all of his travels, he's traveling by sea a lot. And in 2 Corinthians, it talks about how he had been shipwrecked 3 times already, and that's before this, okay? So he's like, this is a massive ship. We find out that there's over 270 people on board. So it's a massive ship. Everything has been extremely difficult to get to where we are. So now to go on and even to just leave here with bad weather, it's a bad idea. So I think we should just stay where we are. Don't go. Verse 11, "Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul." Well, that's not... If you don't know Paul, it's pretty fair. You're like, well, I'm going to go with whatever the captain says and not what this prisoner is telling me to do. So they don't listen to Paul. Verse 12, "And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority, advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening towards the southwest and northwest, and winter there. Okay, so back on our map, we're in Fair Havens. There is another port in Phoenix which is over here, and they say that one is much better. Now, we don't have good winds, so we don't want to go yet. It is worrisome, but they don't want to stay in Fair Havens. Maybe it's a smaller port, whatever. And so they say, okay, we want to go to Phoenix. If we have good winds, we can get there in half a day. It's not that far. So they don't listen to Paul's warning. They want to go. Verse 13 says, when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. Okay, so they're waiting, and these big, strong northwestern winds that have been blowing for the last few weeks, they stop and they go, And there's a new wind coming from the south, and they say, this is perfect. This is exactly what we needed. I was going to say praise the Lord, but these are not Christians. And they say, okay, and so they sail off. They're like, we can get this done. And off they head towards Phoenix. Verse 14. But, those right there ruins everything. But, not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Evroklidon. Do you know what Evroklidon means? It means northeast. So this one stops and this one starts blowing. So what do you think that is going to do? Verse 15, so when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And so off they go and pushed away from Crete. Verse 16, and running under the shelter of an island called Klavda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. So Klavda is right there. They are able to try and get a little bit of shelter from that tiny little island. That's the southernmost island of Greece, called Rhodos today. And when it says they secured the skiff is talking about the little boat that they have, like a rescue boat. Well, just, to be able to, that they have dragging along probably. And so they bring it up onto the boat because they don't have control right now, and that thing is going to fly off from all the waves. Verse 17, when they had taken it on board, that's the little boat, skiff, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. So they are, you know what they're doing? They're getting ropes and they're tying the boat around so that it doesn't break up. That's how bad it is right now. These boats are not made of metal, okay? They're wooden boats being hit by strong winds and strong waves, and so they're putting ropes around the boat so that it doesn't fall apart. And they're afraid that they're going to be blown down to the Syrtis sands. The Syrtis sands were these shallows towards Africa, which sailors were terrified of because obviously you can get stuck there, but it's not close enough to the shore. So if you get stuck there, you're done. There's no way of saving you. And so they're afraid of being blown down south. And so they put down the main mast, and they're like, because it's blowing them down, and they go, let's just hope for the best. But, of course, the wind just takes them away. Okay? So, verse 18. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. Now, what is the whole point of this endeavor? To move cargo from one place to another. It's a merchant ship. And things are so bad in verse 18 that they start lightening the ship, which means that they start throwing the cargo off board. When you're throwing away the one purpose of the, the travel, it means that we don't care about money anymore. That's how bad it is. All we care about now is not dying. Verse 19. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So it's the third day of the storm. Things have not gotten any better. They've already started at least throwing some of the cargo, and now they start throwing away equipment off the boat. Stuff that they will, anything that will lighten the ship, anything, it's being thrown away. They're like, this is terrible. Verse 20. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. So the storm is so bad, it says, for many days they see no sun nor stars. Okay? The point is not simply that, okay, there's clouds and there's a storm, but the point is that we cannot navigate, and we have no idea where we are. We have no idea where we're going. We're utterly lost at sea in a storm for many days, and they finally give up hope. Wow. I read that, and I wonder, is Luke including himself in that? And Paul? And Aristarchus? Or is it like, well, the boat, the ship as a whole lost hope, but not us? I don't know. I don't know. I know that God had given a promise to Paul that he will make it to Rome. He hadn't given that promise to Luke or to Aristarchus. I'm not sure. I'm reminded of another terror at sea. If you recall in the Gospels where the disciples are in the boat and there's a big storm going, and Jesus is not in the boat, the one where he comes and where he walks on water and finds them, right? And they see him and they freak out. They think it's a ghost. They're like, and Jesus says, calm down, it's not a ghost, it's me. And Peter says, well, if it's really you, make it so that I can walk on the water also. And Jesus says, well, come on. And he gets out, and Peter is like, this is amazing. I am walking on water, and I'm heading towards Jesus. And then he gets hit in the face by a wave or something, and he's like, I'm walking on water right now. There's nothing under me, and gets terrified and starts sinking. And he says, Jesus, Lord, help me. And he grabs him, and he says, you of little faith. Now, it's not that Peter didn't have faith. He had faith, but it was little. Why? Because he takes his eyes off of Jesus. He takes his eyes off of Jesus' word that said, you can do it, come on. And he sees the terrifying situation around him, and sometimes this is something that happens to us. We take our eyes off of the Word of God, off of Christ, because the circumstances around us are too scary. And we have little faith in those moments when we need to turn and remember what God has said. And I don't know if Paul is also losing hope at this point. It was a long time ago when Jesus spoke to him and assured him that he was going to get to Rome. I'm not sure, but either way, God is going to be merciful and going to reassure Paul that you're going to make it. And this is what happens, verse 21. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. you must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island." So they've been in the storm for many days, and people have not been eating, obviously, probably because they're seasick. And Paul stands up and speaks to them. Now think about this. Just picture this. We're in the storm. Everyone has given up hope. Who's on this boat? Sailors, soldiers, prisoners. And a prisoner stands up and says, "Listen to me." And they listen to him. Maybe when you have no other hope, you're trying to grab onto anything. And first he says, "Well, I told you so, but you didn't listen to me. However," he says, "I do have a message of hope." He says, "The God whom I serve sent an angel and told me that I must make it to Rome. And for my sake, really, he's granting you all, he's granting your lives to me that you should also survive this. You will all be saved. However, we need to run aground on some island." Verse 27, "Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land." All right, let's go back to our map here. So back out. It says in the Adriatic Sea, that's a bad translation, unfortunately. The Adriatic Sea is up here, okay, between Italy and, Croatia, whatever is up there. Back 2,000 years ago, it wasn't called the Adriatic Sea, first of all. If you look at the ancient text, it says the Sea of Adria. And the Sea of Adria was any sea between Italy and the Balkans. So all of this is the Sea of Adria, okay? And so where were we? We were here when they were hit, and they've been going aimlessly for 2 weeks, but the sailors sense that they're getting near land. If you know the map, you're like, what is that land that they're about to hit over there? Well, we'll get there in a minute. Verse 28, "As they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. So they measure the depth, and they find that that's 120 feet, 36 meters. And they're like, okay. Then they do it again, and it's 90 feet, which is 27 meters. And they're like, oh, we're getting shallower quickly. So we're going to hit land. Verse 29, "Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come." So this is in the middle of the night. And they could probably hear waves crashing somewhere, and they're like, we're near land, and they find out that they're going really quick, and so they drop the anchors, and they can't see. It's still a storm. It's nighttime. It's midnight, and they're like, just hope we can make it through the night so we can see what's happening in the morning. Verse 30. "And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off." Well, this is fascinating. The sailors realized that we're close to land, and they're desperate, okay? And they're like, let's put down the little boat and save ourselves. And Paul turns to the soldiers and he says, if all the sailors of the ship get away, we're not going to get saved. And they go, oh, no. And so they cut the ropes, and away goes the little boat. I want you to note 2 things here. Number 1, Paul says, if the sailors leave, you cannot be saved. Hold on. The angel told Paul earlier that no life will be lost. All of them, 276 of them, are going to be saved. Now he says, if you let these people get away, you're not going to get saved. Well, which one is it? Was that a true prophecy that everyone is going to be saved or not? Could we maybe not all get saved? We've said this a million times concerning prophecy, concerning God ordaining things. The God who ordains the end is also the God who ordains the means to the end. God ordained for all of them to be saved from the storm. The sailors try to go against the ordained will of God. They try theoretically to thwart the will of God. However, God has ordained that Paul will see them. God has ordained that Paul will speak up. God has ordained that the soldiers will listen to Paul and go and cut the thing, and so everyone will be saved as God ordained it to happen. God ordains the end, and God ordains the means to the end. That's number one. Number two, and this is fascinating, note that now the soldiers and the centurion are doing what Paul tells them to do. That's right. They are doing whatever the prisoner told them to do. And we see this even more in the next few verses. Paul just takes charge and takes over the whole situation. Verse 33. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So note now, everyone on the boat is listening and obeying Paul. In all this chaos, in all this panic, in all this hopelessness, there is one guy who is not hopeless. There's one guy who is calm. There's one guy who has a sound mind when everyone else is freaking out. And the soldiers and the centurion and the sailors are doing whatever this prisoner is telling them to do, and they listen and they are encouraged. Paul says, look, he says, you haven't eaten in 2 weeks, and so you need to eat, you need to get some strength, and we're all going to survive. All of us, we're going to survive this, okay? And they all listen to him. I find that many times, something that I've seen in my own life, people who don't ordinarily care what Christians have to say, when their life falls apart, strangely enough, it is to us that they come for advice or for help or for comfort. Maybe this person knows something that I don't know. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul talks about how God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. We don't fall apart whenever things go bad. This is what happens to unbelievers. Unbelievers let the circumstances around them dictate their emotions and their decisions, and they are terrified and they lose control and they panic. But Christians are not to be like this, because we understand that God is sovereign and God is in control of everything. We walk by faith and not by sight. And Paul had a promise that he would make it to the end, and therefore he is calm and he is of a sound mind. Note also here, just as a quick side note, I find this great. Paul says, let's eat. We need to eat and gather our strength. And they all say, okay. And he says, hold on. Before we do that, let's say a word of prayer. And let's thank the Lord for the food. Paul here does not get aggressively evangelistic. There's a time and a place for everything. There is a time to slap people in the face with the truth. Yes, there is. But there are times to be wise and know when to talk and when not to talk. And here, he knows that he's dealing with people who are exhausted, half dead. They're waiting for daylight so that they can get off this boat. And he calmly, without being too forceful, still directs their attention to God. Let's eat. But before we do that, let's say a prayer. Earlier he did this also, where he says, let me tell you something. He could have said, we're all going to survive. But he just says, the God whom I serve has spoken and said that this is going to happen. And he just leaves it at that. There are people who never think about God, except maybe late at night in their beds when they have put away their phone and they don't know what to do, and they think about God and they freak out. But a lot of people don't think about God during their daily life. And it is good, I think, sometimes, even when it's not the right moment for evangelism, still show them that God is a part of our life and that God directs how we live our lives. And so he says, let's just say a prayer, reminding them of the God who made them, reminding them of a God who's in control of everything, just orienting them to God. But let's get back to the text. They have eaten, they are encouraged. Verse 39, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed the bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship, if possible. And so they see a bay. They're like, all right, that's where we need to get, and that's where we need to go. Verse 40, and they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for the shore. So they're like, okay, the wind is blowing that way. We want to go that way. They cut the anchors, put up the sail, and they head towards the beach. Verse 41, but striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violent waves. Okay, so it gets stuck in the ground. Now everything is falling apart, but thankfully we're close enough to the shore. Verse 42, and the soldiers' plan, listen to this, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. Really? Now you're just going to kill Paul and the other prisoners? Now? That where the beach is right there? Let me give you the reasoning behind this, because it's not insane what they're thinking. It's wrong, they shouldn't do it, but their thinking is this. In the Roman Empire, if you're a Roman soldier and you're guarding a prisoner, if this prisoner escapes, then whatever his punishment was, and he escapes, you get it. So if you're guarding someone who is going to be executed, and he escapes, then you get executed. And so the soldiers have all these prisoners who are going to swim to shore now, and they could just get to shore and run away. So let's kill them so that we're safe. We could just say they died at sea, whatever. No one's going to find what happened. Verse 43, thankfully, but the centurion, this is a nice guy, the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them all from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. Verse 44, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship, so they all swim. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. They made it. They made it. 276 souls, and they survived. You want the quick spoiler? Do we know where they have landed? It's in the next verse in chapter 28. I'll just show you where they land. So that's where they were floating. What's that tiny little island there off the coast of, well, down south of, they hit that little island over there, and that is Malta. And we will get there next week. All right. But let me just make a couple of final observations here, and I'll close. Paul went through a lot of hardship in this chapter. And there are many people who, when they see people suffering or people going through great difficulties and hardships, they assume that it is a punishment from God. There are many people like this. When they are going through difficulties, they say, "What sins am I paying for? Why is this happening to me?" Remember Job and his friends. Job is suffering, and what do his friends tell him? "Well, it must be because you're a terrible person, and God is punishing you." However, Paul was not being punished by God. He's going exactly where God told him to go. And what's happening here is the same thing that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. There, Paul is talking about how he has had many difficulties in his life, and he was going through a certain problem, pain, and he asked God to remove it, and God said no. God answered him and said, "No, my grace is sufficient for you. I am not going to take away this problem that you have, but I am going to give you the grace to endure it. I will be with you as you go through it. I want you to trust me that I will take care of you and rely upon me to get you through this difficulty that you have." I think about other sea storms in Scripture. For example, you have, in the Gospels, you have Jesus who is in the boat with his disciples in the Sea of Galilee, and it's going all crazy, and Jesus is sleeping, and they wake him up, and they say, "Jesus, we're going to die." And he wakes up, and he's like, "Oh, calm," and everything just, now they're more scared of Jesus than they are of the storm. There is the other time that I mentioned earlier where Jesus is not in the boat and their disciples are terrified and they're fighting against the waves, and then Jesus walks on water and he comes to the boat, and it says that after he got in the boat, it miraculously just arrived on shore. And you're like, wow, that's impressive. So, reading Acts chapter 27, could God have just calmed the winds? Of course he could. Of course he could. But he didn't. Could God have just gone and take them to their destination? Of course he could. But he didn't. God can calm the storm, but oftentimes he will not calm the storm, but he gives you the grace and the courage to endure the storm. And he asks you to trust him and depend on him to endure. We as Christians, we don't have a promise from God that he's going to get us out of every difficulty. We as Christians don't have a promise that we will survive every difficult situation and never die. We will die. We're all going to eventually die. And Paul eventually died. He was executed in Rome. However, we know, Romans 8:28, that God works all things for the good of those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose. And even when it is our time to die, God will not abandon us. And what have we been talking about chapter after chapter after chapter? About resurrection. And God promises that even when we die, he will raise us from the dead. So, what do? Trust him. Trust him. Cling to his word. Cling to his promises. Even when everything around you is screaming otherwise, you trust in God and hold on to his word. Thank you for your attention. Let's pray.